All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA and DU panel discussion as part of our Innovation Now, New Paths Forward series, entitled The US, China, and Russia, an Innovation Net Assessment. And I'd also like to thank today's panelists, Dr. Robert Atkinson, Dr. Lauren Graham, Dr. Walter Hudson, and Dr. James Mulvenon for taking the time to engage with us today. So before we begin, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll have a Q&A session at the conclusion of our panelists' remarks. So throughout the remarks or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions through the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has 2 overlapping speech bubbles and 1 is a question mark. Also make sure to type in your name and affiliation before you submit your question, or if you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and submit your questions anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. So now I'm going to briefly turn the floor over to the Director of SMA, Mr. Todd Beasy, to kick the discussion off. So Todd, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicole. Hey, welcome everyone to the next event in our Innovation Speaker Series, where we're exploring the role of innovation in the current geostrategic context and as a source of power and potential strategic advantage. So before I introduce our distinguished panel, I want to briefly set the table for the discussion. Innovation among nations is a coevolutionary process, and even an emergent driven by markets, by shocks to the system, by advances, and as they say, the mother of invention by necessity. And this speaks to the need to have an abiding understanding of the relationships between the innovators and their environments and each other. It's a never-ending dynamic between and among the actors, between nations, businesses, and organizations. I think we can all agree that the innovation competitive space is vast, virtually endless number of actors involved in that system. But today we're going to consider 3 very important strategic actors and innovators: the United States, Russia, and China. And the power of the net assessment approach, which is what we're trying to bring to bear in this panel, is as I mentioned, a very powerful form of analysis that considers not only the threat, if you will, or the other players, but also the United States, what we refer to in DoD as blue. Simultaneously, to understand the dynamics occurring between them, and looking for the comparative advantage, the balance problems. So it's an approach that is diagnostic and explores those key and critical balances that provide, again, that comparative advantage. This is deeper than numerical counts, counting capital ships, counting weapon systems, missiles in silos, so forth. It is actually looking at the wherewithal, the bureaucratic structures, the industrial base, and all of the dynamics that are occurring between them that give nations a comparative advantage. One of the great advantages of the net assessment approach is that it can move you from a reactive footing, where you're constantly countering and responding to threats, and put you in a much more proactive stance, where you're actually looking at opportunities and taking advantage of that through the understanding the net assessment. So with that, let me briefly introduce the speakers. Their extended biographies are in your panel booklet. So to kick us off, Dr. Rob Atkinson will look at innovation in the United States. And then we'll go to Dr. Lauren Graham, who will look at innovation in Russia. And then Dr. James Mulvenon will look at innovation in China. And finally, Dr. Walt Hudson will bring us together in a bit of a synthesis, a bit of a net assessment. And the moderator for our discussion is Nick Wright. We're grateful to Nick. So with that, let me turn it over to Rob Atkinson. Rob, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? So
yes, we can.
So ITIF, a think tank, been around since 2006, and we've focused a lot on this question of how the US is faring when it comes to innovation. And by innovation, we don't mean discovery, we mean commercializing innovation in the United States. Doesn't really do us any good if we invent something and it ends up being commercialized overseas, like, for example, historically, the VCR. So we've written lots and lots of reports on that. They're on our website. For example, we wrote a report recently, Understanding the U.S. National Innovation System. We wrote another report about a year and a half ago where we looked at about 30 or 40 different quantitative indicators of innovation and compared where the U.S. and China were in 2006 and where they were in the most recent year, 2016 or 17, when we did the report. And on that, what we found was that on virtually every single indicator, the Chinese were catching up, and on some of them, they had actually surpassed us. I think there's a giant mythology out there that says that, well, China isn't really innovative, and they say that for two reasons. One is there's a sort of conceit that we have the only recipe, that the US recipe is the only one that you can get innovation from, and that a state-directed recipe cannot do that. That's simply wrong. And the second is it conflates sort of new to the world innovation with second to the world innovation. China is maybe not as good as new to the world, although they're getting better. They're pretty darn good at second to the world. And the last mistake I think people make is they look at innovation as science-based industries more than engineering-based industries. The US is better at science-based industries than probably anybody else in the world. China is very good at engineering-based industries. High-speed rail is a good example of that, solar panels. Another whole series we did, which we just wrapped up, we're going to have an event on it next month, where we did 5 in-depth case studies looking at how the Chinese have won in, or what the effects of the Chinese policies are on the rest of the world in solar, biotechnology, high-speed rail, semiconductors, and telecom. And in all of them, the Chinese have either surpassed us or in semis and bio, for example, making significant progress. But what I want to talk about with my few minutes left is not so much about that, but rather about what does that mean for a net assessment? What should we be doing? How should we be thinking about it? Because we really don't know how to do this. I'm sure folks in DoD know how to do a net assessment for defense, but as a nation, we simply don't know how to do this, or we simply haven't built the mechanism, the skills, the muscle memory, if you will. So one of the things I think in any key net assessment on this is we have to look at how foreign policies either intentionally or unintentionally harm US innovation. It's not enough to just look at what we're doing. We have to look at what other countries are doing. I wrote a recent article in the Journal of International Economy talking about power trade and how the Chinese are implementing power trade the way the Germans did from 1900 to the end of World War II. And power trade is to attack the enemies or the challengers' technological advantages. We also need a better framing of this. One of the reasons why we ignore how badly we're doing, and by the way, just a couple of statistics on how badly we're doing. If you look at the last 10 years and you measure it properly, which I'm happy to discuss, US manufacturing is down 11% as a share of GDP, while GDP went up about 16%. You look at the high-tech trade deficit. In 2000, we ran a high-tech surplus. Now we run a high-tech trade deficit. So we need better framing. Number one is this is not about US firms. There are lots of companies in the US that are doing great. They just aren't producing very much in the US. It's not about firms. It's about activity in the US. We get confused. Oh, well, look at what how well Cisco's doing, or I'm not going to pick on any particular company. The question is not how well they're doing, although that's useful. It's what's happening in the US. Secondly, we hear a lot about R&D. Yeah, the US is a leader in R&D, although increasingly we're not. We're falling behind. But again, the question is not R&D. R&D is a means to an end. The means is advanced production, whether that's of software or hardware. And then the other mistake we make is we look only at OEMs. OEMs are important, but if the supply chain itself is not strong in the US, then we're in real trouble. I was talking to the CEO of a company you will all know a few years ago, and he wanted to roll out a flexible display. And I said, "Oh, cool. Where are you going to put your factory?" And he said, "Taiwan." I said, "Why?" Because he said there are no suppliers in the U.S. that come even close to being able to make what we want. So number three, we desperately need better analysis. We simply don't do analysis in this space. You've got DoD's Office of Industrial Policy, which does good analysis in that realm, though. That realm is more defense related rather than dual use and broader commercial. It doesn't exist in the Commerce Department. If you go into the Commerce Department, you don't see analysis. Now, BIS does some analysis, but it's targeted analysis for a particular mission. So we've got little pieces of it here and there, but it never all comes together. Just the amount of things that we simply do not know. We don't know, for example, how much U.S. firms are adopting high-performance work practices and advanced automation. We just don't know that. We don't really understand supply chains. In the Soviet era, we didn't have to worry about supply chains because the Soviets were pretty pitiful. And if they wanted to cut us off, they might cut us off from, I don't know, those little dolls they sell. China has the ability to cut us off on many, many things. What are they? Who knows? Anybody know? No, nobody knows. Nobody knows. And we have to know that. It doesn't mean we have to decouple. That's a different question, but we have to know that. Lastly, I would argue, since we're living in a dual use world, we need to have a dual use agency. And I've been watching with great disappointment in the last week with the crashing and burning of the Endless Frontier Act. I'm being over dramatic, but Endless Frontier Act, Senator Schumer and Senator Young have advanced, which we were quite involved with, helping on. In our view, wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. It was going to give the NSF a technology director that would have been probably 25% bigger than the overall regular NSF, the science-based NSF. And for a lot of different reasons, which I'm happy to discuss, it appears that got dramatically, well, it did get dramatically whittled down in the Senate Commerce version, dramatically whittled down. DOE came in and got their nose in the trough because they could take a bunch of it, and NSF scientists got their nose in the trough to take a bunch of it. But maybe we'll see what happens with it. But at the end of the day, we need a dual use agency. We don't have that. We've got DOD to do its thing. We've got DOE to do its thing. We've got Commerce, which maybe a little bit of it at NIST. But we need an agency whose mission it is to think about analyzing and taking action on this kind of technology policy. And I would argue we don't have it and we need it. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
All right, Dr. Graham, you're next.
All right, Lauren Graham here. If we're going to discuss innovation in Russia, it's important to make a distinction that I think to many of you will be familiar, but not perhaps to all. And that's the distinction between innovation and invention. They're not the same thing. If we define invention as merely the development of new devices or processes, then the Russians are good inventors. If we define innovation to include the acceptance, implementation, and business success of new ideas, then we must conclude that the Russians are miserable innovators. My research has shown that the Russians are much better inventors than most people think. The first steam locomotive in continental Europe was invented by Russians, and the first operational diesel-powered locomotive in the world. Russians first illuminated the avenues of major cities with electric lights long before Edison came along. They transmitted radio waves before Marconi. They built the first multi-engine passenger planes just a few years after the Wright brothers first flew. They created a new plant species through polyploidy speciation. They pioneered in the development of transistors and diodes. They published the principles of lasers a generation before anyone else did, and by the way, won a Nobel Prize in doing so. They built the first electronic computer in continental Europe. But if this is so, if the Russians were pioneers in all these fields, why is Russia today so weak a player in world technology? The Russian economy is largely dependent on oil and gas. It is difficult to name a Russian high technology manufacturer that is world class, with the possible exceptions of makers of weapons or space vehicles, and one or two software companies. Little Switzerland exports each year 3 or 4 times more high technology measured in dollar value than Russia. For 300 years, Russia has been adept in developing clever technical ideas and abysmal in benefiting from them. The Russians are a very creative people, as their achievements in music, literature, mathematics, and basic science richly demonstrate. In these fields, Russians have deeply influenced the artistic and intellectual world. The educated public in America and other countries does not need to be told who Tchaikovsky, Tolstoy, or Dostoevsky were, and scientists and mathematicians similarly do not need to be reminded of the identities of Lobachevsky, Mendeleev, Kolmogorov, or Landau. However, Russia has had creative world leaders only in some areas of intellectual activity, not all. Music, literature, mathematics, and some branches of basic science are largely creations of the mind, able to prosper as long as their practitioners are given good educations and the financial support necessary for them to work in these fields. Russia usually does well in such areas. Technology, however, is a totally different subject. It is where the rubber meets the road, where intellectual creativity engages with society at large in a necessary and complex way, and where society can determine the success of technological projects, perhaps even unintentionally. The success of technology, which usually means profitability in a competitive international market, occurs outside the research laboratory, in the social and economic environment of the society as a whole. Russia has not done well in such activity. Where is the Russian Thomas Edison, Bill Gates, or Steve Jobs? They aren't there. The person who develops an idea with commercial potential needs a variety of sustaining societal factors if he or she is to be successful. The factors are attitudinal, economic, legal, organizational, and political. I could expand on any one of those categories. Society needs to value inventiveness and practicality. The economic system needs to provide investment opportunities. The legal system must protect intellectual property and reward inventors. And the political system must not fear technological innovation or successful business people, but promote them. Stifling bureaucracies and corruption need to be restrained. Many people in Western societies, and increasingly Asian ones, take these requirements for granted. Just how difficult sometimes they are to fulfill is illustrated by Russian history and by Russia today. Now, I must add here in closing that the situation in military technology is a little different. The market factors that are so crucial in the civilian economy are not so crucial in the military one, although there are people who know about that better than I. But profitability, advertising possibilities are far more important in the civilian economy than the military one, and the Russians tend to do better with military technology than civilian ones. However, their weakness in civilian technology laps over and hurts them in the military area. An example there is the development of computers. When computers in the 50s and early 60s were largely matters for academia and the military, Russians did quite well. But when computers became very important instruments in the civilian economy, and banks led the way here, followed by all kinds of other businesses, all businesses one might say, the Russians couldn't keep up. And finally, they had to adopt American standards and became followers. And so we're in a situation where you can ask, who buys a Russian computer today? Nobody. So even though they are better at the military area than the civilian one, their weakness in the civilian area hurts them even in the military area. So I look forward to questions. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Mulvenon, you're next.
Hi, this is James Mulvenon, and I'd like to just make 3 brief points about Chinese innovation. The first, to follow on a number of the comments that Rob made, we have to give credit where credit is due. This is a system that, despite the withdrawal of Soviet technical support, built its own A-bomb, hydrogen bomb, satellites, ICBMs, and just recently was only the 2nd country in the world to put a rover on Mars. We have all read the articles about the fabulous infrastructure improvements in China, the 40,000 clicks of high-speed rail, the hundreds of brand new shiny airports, and all of it looks much better in comparison to our sort of rotting, rusting infrastructure in the United States. As President Biden made a comment when he went through LaGuardia, we're describing it as a 3rd world airport. And, this has been documented. There's successes in these sort of state-directed, big NASA kind of programs, a Manhattan Project kind of programs, has been documented by people like Evan Feigenbaum in his book, Techno Warriors. And some of those dynamics were, incredible amounts of state resources, and huge amounts of focus. But that's not to say that they haven't also achieved some very impressive modern innovations. Despite its beginnings as a copier and a stealer, Huawei, for instance, is one of the most innovative companies in the world and owns 40% of the patents for the 3GPP 5G wireless standard. Obviously, we've all read about mobile payments and how, as a tourist in China, you can't even spend cash now because of the digital economy that they're running there. And I generally hate economists, but I do like one, Alexander Gerschenkron, who had only one good idea. And I think we would all be blessed in our lives to only simply have, if we can, I'll just say we had really one good idea. And he had this idea that he called the advantage of economic backwardness. And China has benefited from the fact that it's been able to go from dirt to wireless, and is not burdened with the legacy systems like we are with our copper phone lines and everything else that has prevented us from making certain leaps. And all of this, has led to the swagger that we see in Beijing, the China dream, the China century, the China model, that has been pushed out now to say China has, the Chinese system is superior than the liberal democratic capitalist world. And the evidence they point to are these innovative achievements achieved through state-directed resourcing. But my second point is they didn't steal all of this, but they stole a lot of it. I've written 2 books on Chinese industrial espionage, the first of which got me declared persona non grata by the Beijing authority, because I guess they also forgot to pack their Leninist sense of humor along the way. But the cyber and technology espionage that we've seen from China can only be described as planetary scale. And it is interesting to match the state industrial planning documents that we see, like the 2006 to 2020 mid to long range S&T plan, which says we're going to leverage technologies from multinationals operating inside of China. But in the cases of technologies that are not available from these multinationals within China, we're going to obtain them by, quote, other means. And the other means in this case deals directly with this issue of cyber and technology espionage. There's been a lot of focus recently in the media about the so-called talent programs that the Chinese run. My organization has documented 507 different national, provincial, and municipal talent programs. And these are designed to give money to individual researchers located abroad who then return to China for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, share their research with Chinese colleagues, massive sort of brain dumps. And the interesting thing for me is, as I'll talk about in my third point, these talent programs are actually essential to fill in some of the mortar between the bricks of the stolen blueprints, the stolen source code, which by themselves don't contain the intangible, organic sources of the innovation, which is largely in the heads of smart people that work in these areas. And so the talent programs are a critical supplement to the cyber and technology espionage we see in terms of, filling in the contextual gaps of the things that have been stolen. And as a result of this cyber espionage and technology espionage, the Chinese have thoroughly decimated a number of American industries, including green tech. And so now 8 out of 10 of the largest solar panel and photovoltaic suppliers in the world are in China. You could look at Canadian companies like Nortel. There's a long list of companies that have been decimated by the combination of Chinese technology espionage and illegal state subsidization of Chinese national champion companies that were designed to displace those Western companies. But my third point is a big but, or as the Chinese would say, 但是, however, which is to say that I do believe that centrally directed R&D or state-directed R&D in this increasingly state-centered economy in China, which has turned its back on the private enterprise driver that really accounted for the first 20 years of China's economic success. For me, centrally directed R&D is an oxymoron on the scale of jumbo shrimp and military intelligence. And so there is a really interesting dynamic that is being widely discussed, by the way, in China about the delta between the massive expenditures, these huge amounts of money that they're spending in all these critical high-tech areas, and the relatively paltry ROI that they're getting for that amount of money. And there's a real frustration, aggression complex that you can sense in the leadership when they talk about these things. It is no accident that Chinese bookstores have special sections filled with books like titles like, "Where is China's Steve Jobs?" Because they don't have a Steve Jobs, very similar to what Lauren was talking about in the Russian case. And for me, as a good analytic Marxist, there are massive structural impediments to innovation in China, whether it is the pedagogical method of the rote memorization educational system, whether it is the lack of legal protections for intellectual property, whether it is the sort of overweening influence of state regulatory apparatus and the desire of the state to put its finger on the scale. All of these things have served over the years to squelch genuine innovation. And if you have any questions about that, you should ask Jack Ma. Because he had the temerity late last year to mock the regulators, and the regulators said, "Au contraire, mon frère," and basically started severing his limbs from his body, and are now calling in all of China's high-tech companies and issuing directives about rectification because they simply became too strong. So this is one of the fundamental pathologies that we see in the Chinese system. And oh, by the way, despite all of the chaos of the last 5 or 6 years in the United States, I'm still going to make an argument about the elegance of the design of our system and its superior resilience to be able to deal with political and economic crises because of the value of an independent media, an independent judiciary, an independent legislature to enforce accountability, even though it's been ugly, certainly. So this has all been exacerbated, these concerns by the leadership, by the high-tech Cold War under the previous administration, by pandemic, and by efforts in certain strategic industries to enforce decoupling. And semiconductors is a perfect case that has exposed real structural asymmetries in the Chinese supply chain, and just how vulnerable they were to shocks related to the inability to obtain access to advanced lithography and EDA tooling to be able to push their agenda. You know, General Selva, when he was the vice chief, was right to say that after his supply chain review, that semiconductors was the hill that we needed to die on, because it is the foundational technology under all the other technologies, and it is one of the, as Rob's organization has documented, one of the few areas where the U.S. still has global leadership in certain key areas. And so the strange good news that I have for all of you, as someone who's usually a purveyor of bad news, is that what we see in the dynamics of cyber threat, also there's a good news story, which is we see the Chinese stealing a generation of technology, and then a vacuum cleaner will appear in China that looks just like a Dyson vacuum cleaner, even the same Pantone of the plastic, because China's very good at reverse engineering. But it's not because they graduate 500,000 engineers a year. Most of those engineers would not qualify as MIT or Georgia Tech level engineers. Instead, per the Russia case, we would call them probably more appropriately technicians. So think more DeVry Institute of Technology rather than MIT, but very good at reverse engineering. But what we see is their inability to not pull the organic, intangible innovation out of the designs that they've stolen. And we see them coming back to steal the second generation and the third generation. So we don't see them breaking out of the espionage reverse engineering trap. Moreover, the global pandemic and the travel restrictions have heavily limited the talent programs as a trans-Pacific brain distribution mechanism for people to get access to that information. And so, not surprisingly, we've seen a corresponding ramp up in cyber espionage to be able to obtain things at distance. And all of this plays into the larger strategic phenomena that I described in my recent War on the Rocks piece called A World Divided, in which I talked about the death of hyperglobalization, which frankly, to be honest, it may have made sense to our betters in Davos while they were eating canapes. But clustering the entire global ICT manufacturing base inside a country that for the last 20 years has been, if not the, one of the most significant cyber threat actors to the United States and engaged in massive cyber espionage, in retrospect, doesn't look like that smart an idea. And so we're now working towards what I call the world divided, where you really have the world dividing into two increasingly distinct technology spheres, something that I've really awkwardly named the Sinotech sphere, where countries where it's largely Huawei and ZTE handsets and it's Alipay mobile payment systems, and they're deeply involved in BRI and the Belt and Road Initiative, and they get money from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing, and something you might call an OECD tech sphere. It's not a US tech sphere, it's not a European tech sphere. It includes the ROCs and the Japanese. And it's very an awkward sort of grouping because we disagree about a lot within that organization, where you have the FANG companies, you know, Facebook and Amazon and Apple and Netflix and Google, and you're using Cisco and Nokia and Ericsson equipment, and you know, and so on and so forth. And it's Google Pay and Apple Pay and PayPal. And the conflict now that we really need to understand is at the amorphous boundaries of these two tech spheres. We still need to have phone calls go from one side to the other, but export controls and supply chain regimes and everything else are now focused on that boundary line. And the Biden administration, from a policy perspective, is now pursuing what they call plurilateral control regimes in certain areas: semiconductors, 5G, quantum, AI, biotech, and probably batteries and electric vehicles, where we can work with like-minded capitalist democratic countries, build licensing regimes within that smaller grouping, build standards within that smaller grouping, and then potentially present unified competitive technology offerings that could compete with the Huaweis and the ZTEs and the other illegally state subsidized national champions. And so that's where I see us moving towards. And let me just stop there, and I look forward to the Q&A.
All right, thank you. And we'll conclude with Dr. Hudson. So over to you.
Hey, thanks everybody, and thank you. These have been some distinguished speakers. I'm very much the junior partner in all this, but what I want to try to do is pull this together in terms of what net assessment is supposed to do, at least in the classic sense that Andrew Marshall developed net assessment. Net assessment has three fundamental characteristics. It's interdisciplinary. So unlike neoclassical economics, it's not afraid of looking at institutions. It's not afraid of looking at history. Rob Atkinson's point about looking at China as a power trader and stop looking at this relationship or this thinking of it in binary terms, that it's either protectionism or free trade. Now, historically, if you look back, there was a more varied understanding of how nations deal with trade. As Rob puts it, China is simply going back to what other countries did as a power trader. So we need to look back at history and institutions. The second thing about net assessment, it's empirically based. It's very important not to simply rely on economic models, but to look at hard data and extrapolate from that data. The third point I think is very important. Marshall said we need to diagnose and not prescribe. We give too many recommendations. They are fragmented. They are simply often opinions disguised as thoughtful, and we need to stop, and we need to pull together data and diagnose. As Marshall famously once pointed out, prescription it corrupts the analysis. What happens is we start sort of prescribing before we have all the data. So I think net assessment can be applied to an innovation ecosystem understanding, and there I think is a way to do it, at least one way to do it. The first thing we have to do, though, is we have to look at the respective behaviors of China and the United States before we look at the intentions of the countries. Because what often happens is behaviors, what's actually going on in the country of China or going on in the United States, is not reflected in the policies that are being promulgated. China was a good example of this. If you look at Beijing, a lot of what was going on in the small firms there at the beginning of the sort of the economic revolution in China was way ahead of what the Chinese government was prescribing. So very often we start with intentions, we look at behaviors. We need to reverse that. We need to look at what are the inputs and how do we look at behaviors? What are the inputs into each system? R&D investment, private and public, for example. And we do look at both China and the United States. We look at outputs. That's often terms in human capital. All right. How many STEM graduates are being graduated each year in particular sectors? The third and the hardest one to evaluate is outcomes. That is innovation outcomes. Because how successful is innovation in both China and the United States? There are some programs out there, but they have to be developed. There's, for example, a program called TechLink that actually looks at the success of bringing patents to market from the DoD sphere. So we first need to look at behaviors, then we look at intentions. Rob Atkinson has an excellent way of doing this through he calls it the innovation success triangle. We have to evaluate each country's, and there are three sides to this. One, their business regulations. Secondly, their trade and tax policies. And third, their actual strategies and policies. So we do that next. So we're not corrupting our understanding of the behavior. The third thing that we often do not do very well is realize our own perceptual limitations. And this is something that Marshall was really, really stressed. And in fact, we saw this, and Dr. Graham is an expert on this. For many years, we assumed that the Soviet Union had a much lower GDP, that their military spending was much lower relative to their GDP, because that's what we did. We mirror imaged them. What net assessment was able to reveal to us was, no, it wasn't 6 to 8% of their GDP. It was 30, maybe even 40% of their GDP. Their entire system had been over-militarized. But net assessment allows us to see our own perceptual limitations and stop mirror imaging. So the trope that China must fail because they are not like us, I would suggest is one of the tropes that allowed them, for example, to accede to the World Trade Organization in 2001. We said, hey, they're just another big emerging market. They're like Brazil, and they'll be more like us. That was a mistaken trope, and that mirror imaging is still very, very powerful within the United States. So we need to understand our own limitations. And the last suggestion I say when we're doing a net assessment is Stop prescribing. Simply identify asymmetries in the system. Where are we strong and where are they weak, or vice versa? Do not go ahead and laundry list, as we frequently see in so many policy recommendations. Here's 25 things we need to do. Stop and simply identify the asymmetries. And there, rather than a strategy, we may have stratagems that can develop from that. The innovation ecosystem is vast. I think it's a little bit folly to say through 10 policy recommendations, we're going to reorient that system. But what we can do is identify asymmetries in the system, and from there, I think develop something more workable. Thanks very much.
All right, Nick, you were leading the Q&A, correct?
Yes, thank you very much, Nicole. So a really fantastic set of discussions. Thank you all very, very much. So the questions, I think, as has been described, we can actually use the wisdom of the crowd to tell us what the best question is. And so with literally twice as many votes as any other question, I'm going to go with anonymous. And this is a China-related question. So if China has committed cyber and technological espionage on a planetary level or planetary scale, how then does the US marshal efforts to to build a counter-espionage response to this on a planetary scale? If this doesn't happen, will the US still be able to compete economically?
Well, the thing is that, you know, obviously one of the areas in which we are talking more and more with the OECD countries is about, you know, the sharing of information and common responses to Chinese cyber espionage. But those are very defensive. You know, a lot of the failures we've had, particularly in the last 6 months, have resulted from a you know, largely defensive mindset. And so all of you know there's only two types of deterrence. Deterrence through denial, which is almost impossible in cyber given the nature of the network, and deterrence through punishment. And so a lot of the suggestions coming out of the last administration, particularly NSPM 13, was to have a much more forward posture, defend forward, persistent engagement. And we're still not very good at it, as SolarWinds and the Microsoft Exchange breaches clearly show. But, you know, there's been some interesting suggestions of OECD level norms that could help. And one of the best is called the hostile packet norm. And basically what it says, and it's based on the idea that most of the networks on the globe are in private hands, that there's the wizards who really run the internet, so it's not a government-centered solution. But it says if the command and control of a specific cyber espionage activity is coming from within a particular country's boundaries, that the CERT of the victim country, the computer emergency response team, notifies the computer emergency response team of the emitting country, and they have a certain period of time to remediate it. And if they don't, then they get dropped in the international peering relationships from their tier 1 peering relationships, and then they lose their ability to guarantee bandwidth to their customers. What that would, you know, immediately the OECD countries would all sign up to this norm regime. What that means is the vast majority of the global network would then no longer be a safe haven or an ungoverned area for this kind of behavior. And this behavior would then be minimized into a very small sort of ungoverned space, which would be much easier for us to ring with sensors through the Five Eyes framework and everything else. And so, you know, localizing the problem, because right now the dilemma for us is that most, if not all, of the most disturbing cyber espionage activity we see is actually originating within US cloud infrastructure on rapidly changing virtual machines. And so, you know, taking advantage of the jurisdictional gap in the United States that, you know, that the 9/11 Commission and everything else highlighted. And so we need to clean up our own backyard. We can do that more easily, but then extend that norm to the globe, because, you know, you can't deter cyber espionage. You know, cyber espionage is good, but you can shape the behavior in ways that makes it easier to track and to remediate. And so as long as we acknowledge from the outset that you can't deter it, that it's always going to happen, but that we don't have to allow it to happen quite so easily. That to me seems to be the area in my discussions with OECD countries where we have the broadest agreement. And
Rob, can I bring you in, because to some extent espionage is always going to happen. There are literally, hundreds of thousands of people paid around the world to commit espionage. So on the second part of the question, if this doesn't happen, will the US still be able to compete economically? So could you speak a little bit to that?
Well, and this gets to the point.
Oh, sorry, to Rob. If
sorry.
Sorry.
Go, Rob. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I guess a couple of things. One is we had a report a couple of years ago by Darren Tremblay, who used to be in the FBI and the Commercial Counterintelligence Division, moved over to, I believe, Georgetown. And he wrote a report about this was, to be fair, a little bit before Trump and Congress beefed it up, but there's significant weaknesses in the FBI's approach in terms of their manpower and everything. We should start there. I mean, some of this is cyber, but we used to have actually a big effort back when the Soviets were trying to do this, and we had all these different mechanisms where FBI would go out and work with companies. We need to beef that up. I think that would help. The answer is. I always remember there was an article in an op-ed in the Washington Post by a guy. Why am I blanking on his name? He just came out with a book, and his argument was, we shouldn't worry about Chinese espionage, cyber theft. We should just innovate faster. I'm like, why didn't I think of that? That's the greatest idea ever. I'm going to go tell the CEO of Intel, just innovate faster. Like, yeah, they're innovating as fast as they can. So I do worry about that. I mean, I think it's, Jim alluded to Huawei. I wrote a report a while back called Who Lost Lucent. And it's pretty clear that Huawei was underinvesting in R&D because they were getting it for free. Now they're obviously investing more, but I think we can't underestimate what a huge advantage that gives to them. And it gives them they catch up faster, and they also probably have a cost advantage. They don't have to pay for it the way we have to pay for it. So I don't think we should just ignore it.
But by the way, just one amusing anecdote. When Cisco sued Huawei for espionage for stealing its iOS. The general counsel of Cisco flew to Shenzhen to meet Ren Zhengfei, the head of Huawei, and showed him, and I've seen it, a 100-slide presentation that was basically one slide after another of side-by-sides of motherboards that were identical, even side-by-sides of manuals in which they just simply copied the typos from the Cisco manual into the Huawei manual. And at the end of this long presentation, multiple hours, Ren Zhengfei said one word. He just looked at Mark Chandler, the general counsel at Cisco, and said, coincidence.
Well, also, we've got to remember Huawei had one of its policies in terms of compensation for its employees was how much foreign intellectual property you stole. So it actually, if you could steal some, you get rewarded. So it's pretty blatant.
So now I'd like to move on to the next question, again, our most popular question. So this is from G.K. Allen, Jr. in the Joint Staff. So in the innovation competition with Russia and China, shouldn't the US consider the innovation and industrial production of our allies as free world, with capital F, capital W, free world innovation? Shouldn't we work together against these competitors? And so I just perhaps, because I know that Lauren is at a bit of a disadvantage as he's dialing in, so he can't read the questions. So Lauren, if you'd like me to read the questions again to you, I'm very happy to sort of read them again or say them a bit more slowly and so on.
Okay. I think I got the question. And I think, what does working together mean? Perhaps the most effective way to work together is to compete with each other fiercely. And the product of such fierce competition is, on the other side, in Russia or China, something that they have trouble meeting.
Yeah, hey, this is Walt. I would say, well, I think that the question is a worthy one. There is a, how shall we say, a little bit of Cold Warism implicit in it. I think the notion of a free world and a non-free world has sort of a pre 1989 quality to it. I think it's much more a continuum nowadays, and I think given the integration of global supply chains, I'm not sure that per se is a way to divide up the world. I think we have to be careful not to fall into that sort of Cold War thinking that there's a free world and a not free world. Whereas I think we should think of it as a spectrum or a continuum in net assessment terms.
Well, it may be a spectrum or a continuum. I'm not against that. And certainly the Cold War model needs to be revised. But the big question in front of us is, can democracies survive and compete? And I don't know how many of you have read the book How Democracies Die or Not. It's chilling. So there is a competition going on, but the old Cold War model is not adequate. I agree with that. But there still is a competition going on.
Well, if I could give a concrete suggestion in the context of the sort of plurilateral regimes that we've been talking about, there is a real concern that until recently, Huawei was the only company in the world that really offered an end-to-end solution on 5G, from handsets to base stations to servers and switches, and that in the OECD context, individual companies were manufacturing pieces of it. But if you're going into a new market, the idea is that you want to be able to provide the whole enchilada. So there's been a couple of interesting developments. One, obviously, there's and it's somewhat controversial, this focus on getting away from the fact that Huawei owns 40% of the patents in the 3GPP 5G standard by embracing by embracing open source and by embracing Open RAN or ORAN. First and foremost, as a way of doing rip and replace of Huawei equipment that are in the tier 3 networks in the rural areas in the United States. But it's been at least officially embraced by the Ciscos and Nokia and Ericssons and the carriers, although there is some question as to whether they're doing it for political reasons and they don't really intend to follow through. But one of the things that needs to be confronted within this plurilateral framework is breaking down some of the antitrust barriers that would prevent Cisco and Nokia and Ericsson from actually collaborating on an OECD alternative to the Huawei 5G complete stack, and possibly basing it on Open RAN to get away from the Huawei patents. And I think that's doable. Obviously, though, the problem is that the CEO of Ericsson in particular has basically thrown down some very serious extortionate gauntlets to the Swedish government, basically saying, either let me trade with China or I'm going to take my ball and go home and leave Sweden. So obviously we have a lot of work to do there, but there are ways around these problems. But there are some significant regulatory barriers to that kind of cooperation, not the least of which is we need to pass a federal privacy law in the United States that's synchronized with the GDPR in Europe and other things so that we can actually harmonize the data transfers necessary to do that collaboration.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to turn to a question from Jack Shanahan, who a number of you will be familiar with as a very senior US figure thinking about AI and really building a lot of the thinking on AI in the Department of Defense. So this is from Jack Shanahan. Rob, I wish we had talked 2 years ago, ! Based on my Project Maven experiences, after we stood up the Joint AI Centre, I spent an inordinate amount of time before I retired trying to figure out how to come up with an, in inverted commas, emerging tech stroke innovation net assessment, close inverted commas, function somewhere in the government, especially in terms of assessments of each military's ability to integrate tech into novel operating concepts. Never got there, unfortunately. So, 2 questions. I think the Intel community should play a big role in this function, How do you view the IC playing in this space? Also, any hope for a re-attack on the bill moving through Congress to bring new life to concept of the net assessment dual use agency, which he thinks is a fantastic idea. Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry, and there was a lot there. So Lauren, especially, if you need me to reiterate any of it, please let me know. But perhaps we'll let Rob respond.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jack. I wish we'd talked 2 years ago also. Well, in terms of the role of the IC, I think it would be good for them to have that capability. Now, anecdotes are not, one anecdote is not data, but I can tell you that some conversations we've had with them, and to be fair, this was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was struck by how little, at least the people we were talking to, how little they knew about what's really going on in China. Now, obviously, under Trump, that's changed somewhat. But what I worry, so I absolutely agree that we need that we need the IC to be involved in that. But what I worry about, though, is this is Walt's point. We can't have a net assessment the way we did in the old days. It has to be dual use in its core. And what I would worry about with the intelligence community sort of driving it is that they're going to look at it from a more narrow, tunneled perspective than what we need to do. Now, one of the key roles they can play, though, is obviously intelligence collection that, say, a group like the Commerce Department would not be able to do, and then figure out ways to be able to meld that in ways that don't, violate sources and methods and things like that. So, at the end of the day, I think we need a civilian agency to do that. Now, to your point about how to do that, I think what we need is a national advanced industry and technology agency. Now, if you look at the Eric Schmidt report that was the DoD AI commission, they proposed that as well. They proposed essentially a national innovation foundation, so something like NSF, but for technological innovation. I think ultimately that's what we have to do. I mean, it's striking that there's maybe 40 other countries in the world that have a science agency and an innovation agency. And we're one of the only ones that doesn't have that. So I think if we had that agency, and again, you could put it in NIST if you really wanted to, but I think it would be better to be freestanding, and you beefed up a fairly serious analytical capability, and then started to basically do interagency collaboration and cooperation around that intelligence, including IC, including defense, including BIS, including others. I think we would get a long, long way.
Hey, can I add on? This is Walt, Rob. I mean, one of the things Marshall noticed, and the reason he stressed net assessment, he said net assessment is not threat assessment. And the IC would frequently revert to threat assessment. And once you revert to threat assessment, you're looking at the worst possible outcome, and all your perceptions are shaped accordingly. So that's why he was loath to sort of cede that to IC folks doing threat assessments. I think Rob is absolutely right. They're great in providing the information, but I think structurally another organization needs to evaluate and assess the information to prevent this reverting to so-called threat assessment.
Yeah. Is this where, Rob, is this where we make our semi-annual plea for the reinstantiation of OTA? Because I still treasure some of those reports as well. We also have to factor in, frankly, from an IC perspective, the heat death of open source enterprise as it crosses into the black hole. The loss of opensource.gov. Senator Warner and others have proposed a standing open source intelligence organization under the DNI, get it out of the DS&T and the DDI at the agency. Because, as someone who works on these issues with the IC, I concur that they know an awful lot about China's hypersonic glide vehicle program, but not a lot about semiconductors. And so a lot of the foundational, fundamental intelligence collection and research is not being done because it doesn't involve national technical means, and the open source intelligence capability has really been hollowed out. So,
Lauren, did you want to come in on the question at all?
Not at all. I'm listening and learning.
See, only when you're very eminent can you say that, and it doesn't sound. Because I could say that and it would be legitimate. Thank you very much, and of course, General Shanahan, if you wish to ask more questions, we'll sort of keep an eye out for those. So next, I'm going to go back to the wisdom of the crowd, and I would just say that we have a lot of questions. We have 20 published questions still left, so I think we're going to have to try and sort of get through the questions a little bit more quickly, just to pile more pressure onto this fantastic panel. So next is from Brian Radzitsky from Lawrence Livermore. A net assessment is a diagnosis of a multi-sided competition. In the classic Cold War cases, a net assessment would look at blue's ability to deter and fight red in a particular theatre or functional domain. In general, it seems that a prerequisite for a net assessment is a sense of what the objectives are for the competition and the metrics for gauging progress towards these objectives. What are US objectives in the innovation competition? US wealth and prosperity, reducing the US vulnerability to Chinese coercion, US technological leverage over China and other countries, something else? If all of these are objectives, are there trade-offs in the pursuit of these objectives?
Well, I could jump into that. We wrote a report, referencing our own work, explaining the difference between productivity, innovation, and competitiveness. The goal of all of this space is not productivity. We could boost our productivity by having better garbage collection and more efficient haircuts. It would do nothing for our ability to compete with the Chinese, nor is it innovation. What it really is and nor is it just simply competitiveness. Hey, we made more shoes and we have a lower trade deficit. I think it's much more narrow than that. The goal is to to be able to field superior technological innovation, as Dr. Graham said, in production, and particularly to be able to make sure we don't have vulnerabilities towards China, and where we could impose vulnerabilities on China if we wanted to. And we're losing both of those right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is Walt. I think the questioner has put his finger on it. First off, we need to establish what are we trying to do, and actually, interesting enough, Edward Luttbach talks about this in a book he wrote in 1998 about turbo capitalism. He said we have a tendency, and it might be because of the prevalence of neoclassical economics in America, to assume that the end result is a sound economy. The end result is the well-being of the American people. And how that's achieved can be done through a multiplicity of ways. And it is not simply about high technology. I mean, one could argue that America was not the foremost technological innovator in the early 20th century, that many of the continental European countries were. But we had developed an ecosystem that could maximize, for example, the production of the automobile. So I think we have to look at this problem holistically, and it's not simply about who has the highest version of technology. Japan certainly did not when it developed the Toyota production system. And of course, you have the whole theory of disruptive innovation by Clayton Christensen that says that it's secondary innovation that eventually drives out the primary innovator. So I think we have to look at this in a broader sense and not simply be what I would consider utterly focused on determining whether we have the latest in technology. It's an important part, but not the exclusive part.
Would anybody else like to come in, or should we go to the next question? Okay. So Gerald Epstein is the next, is the author of the next most popular question, and we're actually, I think this is a really crucial question which has come up. We had a great panel a little while ago with a senior DARPA official and a UK official, and this sort of speaks to a crucial tension. From Gerald Epstein, the OECD sphere, in inverted commas, has considerable incentive to collaborate on security policies to push back against China. But while they also have economic incentives to oppose China, they're competing with each other economically. Given that security now depends on technologies pioneered by the commercial firms, which are competing against each other in Western countries, how do we manage security collaboration amongst economic competitors? Over. And perhaps I might actually ask Lauren if he might speak a little bit, because I think there are some crucial sort of, perhaps some perspective from the Cold War and from US-Soviet interactions that might, help us understand a little bit about this question.
Well, the best defense is an offense. The most precious thing that the United States possesses on these kinds of subjects is having an environment where some inventive character can start a company, in the proverbial garage, and manage to make a success of it. Of course, there are more failures, many more, than there are successes. But the United States is still better at that than any other country in the world. We have to protect that, and that's the first thing. Then, of course, we're going to have secrecy and protections of intellectual property. Those are defensive things. They're important, but they're less important in my mind than the offensive, to use a kind of a crude word, capability to invent and innovate faster and better than anybody else.
Thank you very much. Any of the other panelists?
I just have one interesting case study. 2 years ago, when Mark Liu and his entourage from TSMC, which is now widely regarded as the most advanced semiconductor manufacturer in the world, given Intel's recent stumbles, was in DC, and he said to this audience where we were meeting with him, I want to provide chips to Huawei HiSilicon, and I want to be a trusted foundry for the Pentagon. And we said, well, I'd like to eat ice cream all day long and have a really hard six-pack, but that's just simply not going to happen. And so out of that meeting came an interesting discussion related to Japanese auto manufacturers and how they dealt with geopolitical conflict. And the result, of course, as we all know, was that the Japanese car companies started building cars in the United States, employing American workers. And people would say to me, why do you drive a Honda? Why do you drive a foreign car? And I'd say, foreign car? I said, the Honda's, headquartered in Springfield, Ohio. It's not, just happens to have a Japanese name. And out of that grew, I think, TSMC's plan to build a large foundry in Arizona. In other words, to diversify their risk from being in the range ring. But, and this gets to the questioner's sort of intent, the immediate discussion that we started having was, what is the technology control plan? What is the human resources and counterintelligence personnel security plan? What is the network security plan for that fab so that it is firewalled from the fabs in Hsinchu and can be actually integrated into a trusted foundry network for the Pentagon and other people in the United States? And so what that meant was that we had to, again, abandon this globalized sort of utopian ideal that, that companies can operate anywhere in the world and that they rise above sovereignty and borders and all these sorts of things and, exist on another plane, but recognize, in fact, that those national boundaries under a techno-nationalist sort of emerging world are more important, and that companies, can't simply have a rep office in Beijing that has unfettered access to the intellectual property databases in Santa Clara, California. That you have to be smarter than that in this environment. And so, so it acknowledges the threat, but still says that we need to have transnational collaboration. But it just to be smarter about it, and frankly, to spend more money on the kinds of security frameworks that people were previously unwilling to spend money on.
Thank you very much. And so now I'm going to turn to a question from Todd Veazey, the director of SMA. It is increasingly apparent that our bureaucracy is increasingly overmatched by the sophistication and complexity of the global environment. To Rob's point, we lack the analytical tradecraft to effectively diagnose the, in inverted commas, innovation environment. I'm not sure how well our competitors are performing, but it would seem to be a massive comparative advantage if the US and allies could develop and scale the necessary analytical capability. If you agree, can you offer thoughts on how we might build this capability? What education and training is required?
So I can jump in. There's two issues there. There's the issue of sort of the human capital pipeline, and then there's the issue of how to create it right now. As I said before, one of the things that we just lack is where would you go right now in the US government for this information? And the answer is nowhere. There is no place that has this as its responsibility. Now, different places have different components, like BIS has a component about certain kinds of export controls and the knowledge you need to manage a system like that. But we don't have anybody whose overarching responsibility is to figure this out. The other problem we have is the people we've trained. Frankly, we don't train them on this because this is if you think about what it's economics is not about innovation systems. It's not about industries. It's not about firms. The closest you're going to get are business schools, because business schools at least teach you some extent about industry operation and certainly firm operation. So that's why groups like McKinsey, for example, do some reasonably good thinking about these kinds of questions. So part of it is we need to develop the pedagogical systems around that. We need to, for example, we should be funding 20 public policy programs in the country to train how to do industrial policy. Right now, the number of those are 0. We don't train about doing industrial policy because industrial policy is a dirty word. And so we need to get away from economics and economists who really fundamentally just simply don't understand this stuff. They're not trained for it. Their discipline doesn't give them the skills they needed. And then look to other disciplines, public policy, engineering, business schools, things like that.
Can I jump in? This is Walt. I think Rob's point about McKinsey is a good one. So McKinsey does this kind of analysis at the firm level. So there is sort of a template to do this in a microeconomic way. So that can be extrapolated, point one. Point two is, Rob, I think you also pointed out, European countries do this. The OECD publishes an Oslo guidelines on how to evaluate innovation ecosystems. It's about a 150-page document. The European countries do this. So we have models. We have on the micro scale at the firm level, we have McKinsey. We have European countries that apparently do this. So yes, there are extant ways to do sort of innovation ecosystem net assessments. The third point is, it may be we don't bite off more than we can chew initially. Instead of in examining, for example, the entirety of the system, examine an innovation sector. We could evaluate, I think, in half a year, let's say, the aerospace innovation ecosystem comparatively. Do it that way and use it as a tile in the mosaic, so to speak, of net assessments. I think if we did that in an iterative way, we could build up a capacity and a capability to do net assessments in this sphere.
And I mean, James, in particular, I mean, for example, if I were to look, so we're thinking of a net assessment. So this is a capability that it's being suggested that the US acquires or builds. So, I mean, do the Chinese have anything approximating to this type of capability? And are they planning for it?
They do, but it's also heavily politicized. So some people on the line, I mean, certainly Dr. Marshall was always very focused on the Chinese Comprehensive National Power Indexes. And of course, every think tank in Beijing develops their own CNP estimate, and they don't agree. So, I mean, I suppose dialectically, we're supposed to believe that they're asymptotically moving towards the answer. And within the National Development Resource Reform Commission and within the MIIT, they have entire bureaus devoted to this. But again, they often don't acknowledge China's blind spots because a lot of them are politically uncomfortable related to supply chain vulnerabilities and things like that. So there's a real politicization. I would on our side, I would point out that I've run across many. It's primarily the big four firms, so it's like Deloitte and EY and McKinsey and Accenture. There's an awful lot of SCI cleared people running around in the Pentagon doing these studies for R&E and for DITSA and for the Navy has an Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis. The Air Force has an Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis, but it's very fragmented. It's very fragmented and stovepiped, and in some cases unnecessarily classified, given the open source inputs that went into the analysis. And so you find these little pockets within the U.S. government, but Rob is absolutely correct that it's never elevated to sort of a national visibility that allows it to be subject even to peer review.
So the next question is from Justin D. So to maintain our competitive advantage, does the US need to create mechanisms for government and private capital to collaborate in development and acceleration of new technologies and supporting startups? Rather than siloing tech development in NSF, DOE, DoD, etc., what if we had a government-wide representation alongside private capital, meeting with and shepherding new startups and technologies into the economy?
Well, I think we need to do a case study of DIU and sort of where it has succeeded and where it has not. In particular, one of the things that we've discovered in our work on Chinese venture capital firms operating in Silicon Valley and Boston is that they look at the DARPA and IARPA research priority lists, look at where those first stage fundings go, and then they just draft right behind them and do the rapid second and third rounds of funding. And so what we were discovering was that DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit, was doing a good job of sort of spotting and assessing where we needed to be spending our money, but then sort of beggaring it on the resource side and then not being nimble and rapid enough in the turnaround to prevent other people from sort of taking advantage of our seed funding and then taking over the series with the individual startups.
Yeah, can I just say, I think having a program that focuses on what Rob and your sometime collaborator Michael Lind is called national developmentalism is in fact was very much part of the American political system until the last half century. I mean, one could argue that goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, but even in the 1920s, Herbert Hoover fostered so-called associationalism, where private industry would meet with government and there would be a share of information. So this is not something that is has not been done in the American system. It's only in the last, one could argue, in the last 50 years that that has gone away. So it's something that definitely needs to be revisited. I think people have been scared about, notions of industrial policy and the like. But in fact, that's an anomaly, one could argue, in the American system. The American system is premised on a collaboration with government and private industry. In fact, one could argue that was the basis for the American success in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
So a couple of things on that. Yeah, I agree with that, Walt. A couple of things we forget about here. We already have a bunch of business financing programs. So we have SBA, we have the, what's the name of it? The SS something or other. It's an investment program that was just revamped and expanded in Treasury Department. But you know what share of SBA money goes to manufacturing? Something like 7%. They fund liquor stores. I'm serious. You look at the SBA, liquor stores, because it's super important that we have more innovative liquor stores in the country. Thank you. I agree with that, especially home delivery. But my point is, we have financing programs. We should just redirect them. That's frankly what Senator Rubio was trying to do when he was head of the Small Business Committee. He was trying to refocus some of those programs. Secondly, we had a program created after the Japan challenge in the 1980s at NIST called the Advanced Technology Program. ATP gave out grants. I think they were kind of 100%ish if you were a startup and 50% if you weren't. Incredibly successful program. Been studied up and down, all out. Incredibly successful program, and it was killed because of it was quote industrial policy. So we could do that. The third thing we need to do is we're a big country, we're not Finland, and so a lot of this action, particularly with startups, is going to happen at the regional level. And all 50 states have essentially technology-based economic development programs, and they have financing programs for technology-based startups. I think the Fed should just basically match those dollar for dollar. To say if you're going to be investing in technology startups to help them get off the ground, sort of early seed money, before a VC would go in, we should be supporting that. So there's a lot of things we could do there that would easily move the needle, I think.
Great, and now a sort of follow-up question or a related question. This is from Jim Krupe. So why is it that the solution is always another government organisation instead of a private-public partnership on the scale of a Manhattan Project but privately overseen? As a panelist pointed out, the government got us to where we are now. What makes the panelists think it will get us out of a situation that you put us in?
Well, look, I got to jump on that one. If you're a loyal reader of the NDU Prism magazine, which I am, you'll note that the last issue had an article by me in that. Yes, the U.S. government got us into this situation. It got us to be the world's leading innovative country. That's what it did. You go back and you look at World War II and all the way through to the early 80s. In 1964, the U.S. government invested more in R&D than every other country and business in the world combined. Take every business outside the U.S., every government outside the U.S., USG was spending more on R&D. So the U.S. government, I would argue, didn't get us into this. It was frankly what got us into this was the decline of R&D, the decline of having a policy. We're spending less on R&D than we are now as a share of GDP than before Sputnik. It was also the unwillingness to challenge corporate short-termism and the way the equity markets have evolved to pressure companies to reduce basic and applied research. So I'm not saying government's perfect, but if you go back and you look at the history, an objective history of where government has intervened to try to drive innovation, you find 10 success stories for every failure. And I'm glad they're failures because it means we're taking risks. But I always, one last thing, I always remember I was at a salon dinner in Washington on this, and some libertarian conservative think tank guy comes up and he says, look, we all know the government doesn't do anything. I mean, just look at the internet. Yeah, I would look at the internet and say it wouldn't exist without the government. So I think it's frankly the opposite. We need a more aggressive government policy. And I think if we design it right, the evidence shows that you can run things very, very effective. But you have to have the right design framework and the right guardrails and tools in place.
I think this is Walt. I think the history suggests exactly Rob's point. I think what happened in the Cold War, so much of the modern American economy is predicated on basically spin-offs from the defense sector. Everything from commercial aircraft to the internet itself, it derives from so much that was done at the height of the Cold War. But I think that geopolitical structure sort of masks that. And so we constantly saw things in national security terms. But I think if you remove that filter of national security, you realize we were conducting industrial policy at the height of the Cold War. And the result, one could argue, is the modern American economy. So I think it's a little bit of a to suggest that the government is the problem is not a right way to frame the problem. Sometimes the government is the problem, but sometimes it's part of the solution. And I think the long, a complete view, a holistic view of American history suggests that.
I mean, think counterfactually. Do you think that if the Chinese military had invented the internet, that they would have allowed it to develop for 20 to 25 years in a laissez-faire fashion and let it become the basis of global commerce and not assert, their complete dominance over the standard setting and over the way it was, even structured. But that's exactly what the Pentagon did.
Lauren, would you like to add anything on this?
Well, I agree with that last comment, or at least the implication of it. And I think that the United States should have courage about its own system. Right now, I think there is a wave of pessimism about whether democracy can work or not, and whether or not our economic system can work. I think on the whole, we've been a great success story. I think right now we're in a bit of a low. I think we will come out of it. We are a little bit frightened of China. It might be worthwhile noticing that since the early 1950s to the present, China in the natural sciences has won only one Nobel Prize. And that Nobel Prize was based upon traditional medicine in China. The United States remains the most creative country in the world. I have a feeling that our discouragement, that's a combination of the Trump years and the pandemic and a few things, those have all made us a little artificially pessimistic. Have courage, bet on your strengths. We'll make it.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And so I think I'm just going to make two very quick comments, just looking through the questions. So Jack Shanahan has very kindly just put the link in the questions to Rob's recent piece. So that's quite a good recommendation. And I would also just say there's an interesting question I wish we had time for from somebody from the Elizabeth Chamberlain from the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis, which we don't have time for, but Elizabeth, we will send that to the panelists. And so we have 2 more minutes, and I think Lauren gave us a wonderful wrap up of some of his insights. And so perhaps I'd just call on each of the 3 panelists just a very brief final comment on what do you really want this audience to know or do differently?
So I can jump in. So I don't disagree with Lauren's remarks about, we have a system and it's a good system. I don't think that's quite the right way to frame it, though. The right way to frame it is like, can we be better? God helps those who helps themselves. So we can't be like Hertz and say we're number one and we're just going to keep going. What's interesting is one of the reasons, certainly not the only reason, one of the reasons why the U.S. rebounded after the Japanese challenge was because Congress and the Bush and Reagan and Bush administrations took this challenge seriously. We put in place the R&D tax credit. We put in place the SBIR program. We did the Federal Lab Tech Transfer Act. We did the Bayh-Dole Act. We did a whole lot of things that helped. I'm not saying they were the dominant thing. They weren't, but they certainly helped. We didn't say, well, hey, we got a great system. We can just sit back. And I think the same thing is true today. I wrote a piece recently for the American Compass Journal, and it argued that we're not talking about becoming like China. That's sort of a bifurcated Manichaean debate. Well, we'll be like China. No, we should absolutely not be like China. But it doesn't mean we should be a Cato Institute libertarian paradise either. We can do, and we are doing, and we can do more sort of smart industrial policy or tech policy that makes sure the private sector is at the front, the private sector leads, markets and IP are respected, but the government can and should play a supportive role to make that even better.
I agree completely.
I really wish people wouldn't agree. That's terribly, that's not good for our ratings. James, can you really say something provocative and divisive, please?
Oh, 100%. I'll embrace the dialectic right from the outset. I just want to reemphasize the point that as Lauren said, that we are in sort of this national malaise, and it's easy to get swept up in the Chinese swagger, and the Chinese are projecting that swagger on all frequencies right now, and transmitting on all frequencies. But it's really important to remember that underneath that, when policymakers say to me, what's the one counterintuitive thing I need to know about China? As I say, it is a leadership that has external swagger, but is built on deep, deep insecurities. And that there is a sort of rotted structural feature of their system that is, being exposed occasionally. That is really important for us to remember, and I would only sort of supplement Lauren's comment by re-emphasizing the resilience of our system, the resilience of the design of our system at a fundamental molecular level is much less brittle than the system that we see in the PRC. And so while they are, engaged in tremendous, achievements, much as Stalin did with, chemical industries and Magnitogorsk and all that other stuff, is that we have to understand the fundamental structural features of the system and frankly, double down. We need to reinvest in ourselves, and we need to double down on what we do best and use market-based policy mechanisms to encourage us to be our best. But this idea that somehow we have lost the contest in global governance, I find ridiculous. So,
thank you very much. We're 2 minutes over, so I'd like to just ask Walter if he wants to say anything, and then we'll.
Yeah. So my final.
Then we're going to go to Todd Beasley. Oh.
Yeah. Can I just
Todd Beasley just say thank you afterwards?
Okay. Real quickly, I just think we need to stop making assumptions, such as we're inherently better or worse. That's what net assessment is supposed to do, is stop the assumptions. Stop the binary. Is it free trade or protectionism? Is it libertarianism or socialism? Net assessment says stop making those assumptions and just start analyzing first. So I think that's the crucial point of Andrew Marshall. Thanks.
And Todd, over to you for the final words of wisdom to go beyond our binaries.
I'd just like to offer my deepest thanks. I think this was a super energetic. I think we might have broke a record for the number of questions, all because of the insightful comments.
Oh, Todd, it's a little bit hard to hear you.
Headsets, huh?
There you
Can
go.
you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, offering my deepest thanks. This was, I think we might have set a record for the number of questions that came in today, and that is actually a very high bar to cross, and you guys did it. I think you can see the power of this net assessment thinking, and all of you embraced it and brought it to bear. There's a tremendous diagnostic, lots more work to be done. We're not going to boil the ocean or bury the ocean in an hour and a half, but super grateful and thank you on behalf of the community for all that you're doing and all of the thinking that you're contributing to this great nation and to our talk today. Thank you.
I'll be back. Bye.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in today, and thank you to all of our panelists for speaking today. So have a great one.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
You.